You described this morning before the hearings that a couple of years ago, the lawmakers, or at least some of them, didn't exactly acquit themselves well. I think you described it as some sounded like grandparents calling for tech help. They did a little better this time around, didn't they?
They did. There was obviously a lot more research done. I mean, they've had over a year to do this. There was documents, there were sharp questions, not always time for sharp answers, but they were definitely, most of them, a lot more prepared to be on topic and to know more about the technology they're talking about.
Interesting to me was they didn't seem to have a lot of safe harbors in that they were getting it from both sides of the aisle today. On the subject of too much consolidation of power in too few hands, did you get the sense that it wasn't just for show, that particularly Democrats are serious, that a few of the folks that testified today are going to face some serious regulatory concerns, if not this year, maybe next?
Yeah, it definitely seemed like it was something they were interested in changing, of really addressing with the tech executives and not just, saying out loud for show or for fundraising. They were very focused today on the topic. And that's hard because the issues with each of the four companies are kind of vastly different from each other.
To that end, which one do you think the monopoly concerns are most acute for? Certainly Bezos had some answering to do vis-a-vis Amazon, but also Facebook got the question from a few folks. Who do you think's the poster child for those that have cornered the market more than others?
The tricky part about that is they're completely different markets. Like Amazon is being focused on for the online retail market. Facebook is social media. Apple is their app store. It's really hard to tell. And that's why it's interesting to have them side by side, because in their own ways, they're all extremely large giants and they're not even necessarily competing with each other. They're squashing sort of smaller companies that are trying to come up in the same spaces.
Heather, another issue was concerns about bias from some of the tech giants, specifically voiced by conservatives. If you're a tech giant right now, you got a tough kind of needle to thread here, in that you don't want to be perceived as showing bias to one political side, but at the same end, if you don't police some of the dialogue going on your end between fake news and hate speech, you're also going to be accused. How do you think that was acquitted today?
It seemed like a lot of the conservative lines of questioning were not exactly on topic. I mean, you could argue that by not favoring conservative voices, these companies are a monopoly of sort of tone policing who's on it. But it did seem a little bit off topic whenever those came up. And you could argue a lot of it is being done more for show. It was a bit more dramatic when it was questions about conservative voices on platforms, and some of them cited sort of debunked sources like Veritas. And it was sort of a different outcome. They weren't hoping necessarily to break these companies apart and regulate them, but just bring more attention to something that they thought was unfair.
And how about privacy infringement? And to me, it was surprising that some would even answer the question as to whether or not our information is being given to third parties. To me, it's surprising that we still sit here today and we're not clear exactly where our personal information is being used, and maybe the horse left the barn and a lot of people don't even care anymore. But it seems pretty telling that we can't, after today's hearing, we still don't know who's getting what of our information.
And it's extremely complicated. And in some ways, the tech companies are relying on it being too complicated for people to adequately pursue. You have your information being used, but anonymized, meaning it doesn't have your name attached to it. But that can be easily traced back to people. Now, researchers have shown that anonymous doesn't really mean that anymore. It could be how they're using it. If they're only using it for their own products, who else is getting access to it? It's so complicated that I don't think it's going to be unpacked adequately in a few-hour hearing that's live on TV. But one thing I will say is the people asking questions about it did seem to have a much better grasp on the issue than before, that they are knowing what questions to ask about data privacy.
How about Facebook and the questions about being socially responsible, et cetera? Zuckerberg hasn't always acquitted himself very well in front of the camera, in front of these hearings. How do you think he did when there was no real easy answer for him?
He is kind of a veteran of this. This is his fourth time in front of this crowd, which is more than any of the other executives. He knows how to do the old trick of saying statements that sound like an answer but don't actually mean anything, which is something they've all been practicing nonstop. And I think what's going to be more telling is what the next steps are. Is there's no right answer for him. For a lot of these people aren't really expecting some new burst of honesty from Zuckerberg about his role in this. And so we're going to have to see what happens next for that.
Why wasn't Twitter there today?
Twitter's a small little company compared to these big guys. And I think just by market cap, it's nowhere close to any of them. I think the people who wanted Twitter there really wanted to talk about the issue of conservative bias, where it does play an outsized role, but it's not really sort of in the same world as these other companies.
So finally, Heather, we sit here a year from now. Do you think anything's really changed? Maybe they're a little bit better prepared today, but do people really have the appetite to rein it in? I know at one point somebody described, I think it was Google, that you went from a turnstile to a walled garden. It was a good line, but I wondered, okay, will anybody really change anything as it relates to them being a gateway a year from now? It seems they've almost grown too big to really do anything about it.
And I think the timing is a big part of this. Like, is anybody going to change anything about these companies right now in the middle of a pandemic and an election year? That's trickier. But I do think it is setting up for some big changes down the road, or at least some more sort of incidents like this where we get together, we get more answers, more inquiries, more regulation. I don't think this is going to be it and we'll stop talking about it. I do think this topic is going to keep coming up. It just might not be something that happens this year.
Okay, and we will talk to you when that does happen. Heather Kelly, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.